Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Sustainable Development Goals, we will be talking about climate change, its mechanisms and impacts. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Asmita Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi is Academic Coordinator at Consortium for Educational Communications, New Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Amrit. Dear students, as you know, this lecture on climate change is a part of ongoing lecture series on sustainable development goals, as climate change is one of the 17 challenges to be accomplished by the 2030 as adopted by United Nations. There are 17 challenges or goals to be achieved by 2030, and there are some targets which are set to be achieved under this climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So before starting today's lecture, I would like to mention those targets in brief just for you. So let's have a look on the targets. Like the first target is strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. Integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies and planning. Improve education, awareness raising and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction and early warning systems. Implement the commitment undertaken by developed country parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion annually by 2030 from all sources to address the need of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation. For fully operationalize the Green Climate Fund through its capitalization as soon as possible. Promote mechanism for raising capacity for effective climate change related planning and management in the least developed country and small island developing states, including focusing on women, youth and local and marginalized communities. So these are the targets which are set to be accomplished under Sustainable Development Goals. So after these targets, let's have a look and let's start today's lecture. The objective of this lecture includes to define climate and climate change, mechanism of climate change. We will be talking about major greenhouse gases, their sources and their impact for our climate, and we will also be talking about indicators of climate change with evidences which are produced from various scientific institutions. So before we start, you should know that there is a difference between climate and weather. Both of the terms are not same, as they are both are being used synonymously in our daily lives, but there is a difference, as weather is characterized as average atmospheric conditions, and whereas the climate is the average of all the weatheric phenomena over a long period of time. There are some characteristics which make both of the term different from each other. For example, weather is related to short-term phenomena. It covers limited area. It can change rapidly. That is why it is difficult to predict. Whereas climate is long-term phenomena. It covers wide area that could range from few kilometers to a region or a continent. It also includes the seasonal variations in climatic conditions or weatheric conditions, and it is measured over a long span of time that could range to a decade, from a decade to a millions of years. So these are the difference, and in short we can say that weather is what is happening outside of your window right now, and climate is the average of these weatheric happening over a long period of time. So after learning the difference of weather and climate and understanding what the climate is, let's have a look on the definitions of climate change given by two pioneer institutions which are devoted to work in the various fields of climate change. The first institution is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is international body which is devoted to scientific assessment of climate change. As per the definition given by IPCC, a change in the state of climate that can be identified by changes in the mean or variability of its properties and that persist for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Climate change may be due to natural or internal processes or external forcing or to persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere. As per this definition, this focuses on natural and human induced forces as the cause of present climate change. So let's have a look to another definition which is given by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC. UNFCCC is an international body under which various negotiations in terms of climate change mitigations and adaptation are taking place. So according to the UNFCCC, a change in climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activities that alters the composition of global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. And if after seeing this definition focuses mainly on human activities as the cause of the climate change. So after analyzing these two definitions, some conclusions can be drawn about climate change. Like climate change is a significant and lasting change in statistics of average weather patterns over period ranging from decades to millions of years. It may be a change in average weather conditions or the distribution of events around the average. Climate change is not a new phenomenon and the climate changes from glacial to non-glacial ages. Climate change may be due to the natural processes or human induced, but the present cause of concern in terms of climate change is the high rate of changes due to anthropogenic factors. So these are the mainly characteristics of climate change. There are few observations of international scientific community which will help you to understand the changing pattern of the average climatic conditions. The first observation is related to the temperature and which states from 1880s to 2012 the average global temperature increased by 0.85 degrees Celsius, and it is important to note here that with each 1 degree increase in temperature the crop yield will decrease about 5%. Another observation is related to oceans and states ocean have warmed and the amount of snow and ice have diminished and sea level has increased. From 1901 to 2010, the global average sea level increased by 19 centimeter as ocean expanded due to warming and ice melted. And it is important to note here that given the current concentration and ongoing emissions of greenhouse gases, it is likely that by the end of this century, the increase in global temperature will exceed by 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to 1850 to 1900. Global emission of carbon dioxide have increased by almost 50% since the 1990s, and emission grew quickly between 2000 and 2010, then in each of the 3 previous decades. And it is essential to note that it is still possible by using wide array of technological measures and changes in behavior to limit the increase in global mean temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. So these are the facts which are which are observed in terms of climate change. So the question arises, what are the mechanism or what are the factors which are causing imbalance in the average statistics of climatic conditions. These factors are known as a mechanism, which include natural factors as well as human factors. As per natural factors or natural mechanism of climate change is concerned, it includes variations in solar output and geothermal energies, topographical structure of any region, for example like mountainous region, plain region, coastal areas, etc. And the other mechanism is ocean currents, as ocean currents have significant impact on regional or global climatic conditions, including El Nino and Southern Oscillation. ENSO event also has significant contribution in the variations of the global climate, and more specifically the climatic condition of Indo-Pacific region. Another natural factor is orbital variations and emission of harmful gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, etc. through the volcanic eruptions. And plate tectonic is also very important factor to influence climatic variations, as it is responsible for reconfiguration of land and sea area around the Earth's surface, including more structural changes, and thus it can change the climatic condition throughout the world or regional climatic conditions. As the latitude is another important mechanism, latitudinal locations determine the regional climatic conditions. As we know that if we move southward or northward from the equator, the temperature starts decreasing, and this decreasing temperature have significant influence on the climatic conditions and precipitation pattern of the regional or global climate. So after this, I would like to tell you that these factors do not cause any harm to the atmospheric conditions or human civilization, as it is natural process and due to homeostatic characteristics of the atmosphere, which helps to keep atmosphere in balanced state. The another factor, human factor, that is which contribute to the changing pattern of climate change, and the human factor mainly include those activities which contribute to the emission of greenhouse gases. These activities involve deforestation, transpiration, decomposition of waste products, fossil fuel combustion, land use change, cement industry as well as other industries, etc. These activities altogether cause an increase in greenhouse gas concentration into the atmosphere and lead to greenhouse gas effect, which results in global warming and changing climatic pattern. Here I would like to tell you that gases that trap solar radiation into the atmosphere are called greenhouse gases. For example, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, chlorofluorocarbon, etc. These are the main gases which cause greenhouse gas effect. So let's have a look on the process of greenhouse gas effect. Greenhouse gas effect is a process in which, due to the concentration of some greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it traps radiation emitted by the sun that allows incoming sunlight to pass through but retain heat radiated back from the Earth's surface. And here you can see in this diagram that a layer of greenhouse gases is present between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. This layer allows to pass through the solar radiation to the Earth's surface but retains heat radiated back from the Earth's surface. And as the concentration of greenhouse gases increases in this layer, which enables this layer to trap more heat, and this process lead to global warming or increases in the surface temperature. So the main cause of this anthropogenic climate change is greenhouse gas effect. But here I would like to tell you that greenhouse gas process or effect is a natural phenomena which helps to maintain temperature or climate stable, and this process is very essential for the survival of human being. But some certain human characteristics contribute increase in greenhouse gas emissions in this layer, and thus the resultant global warming occurs with a lot of impacts, adverse impact like temperature increase, changing pattern of precipitation, sea level rise, etc. So these are this is the greenhouse gas effect, and the major greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, water vapor and methane, which contribute to the most in trapping the heat in the atmosphere. As far as the sources of greenhouse gases is concerned, major sources of carbon dioxide includes fossil fuel combustion, transportation, electricity generation, respiration, volcanic eruption and land use change, etc. Sources of water vapor includes ocean, rivers, plants, soils, etc. Methane sources of methane gas includes wetlands, oceans. Here I would like to tell you, ocean alone contributes 10% of the global methane gas emissions. Another sources include combustion of fossil fuels, agricultural activity, especially paddy agriculture, livestock farming, waste disposal from home and industries. And in the next slide you can easily see the contribution of various greenhouse gases to the climate change over the last century. So here you can see the largest contributing gas to global climate change over the last century is carbon dioxide with its 66% of share, and second largest contributing gas is methane with its 15% of contribution. The third largest gas which contributed to climate change over the last century is chlorofluorocarbons, and other gases with nitrous oxide contributed 11% to the total greenhouse gas emission which was responsible for climate change over the last century. Here you can see the largest contributing gas is carbon dioxide over the last century. So there are some sources which were responsible for the greenhouse carbon dioxide emission over the last century. That includes 4% of carbon emission come from industrial process, 7% come from agricultural, 21% carbon dioxide come from transportation, 65% come from fossil fuel generation, etc. And here in this diagram you can see the share of various gases and sectors in the global greenhouse gas emissions as in 2011. Here you can see that carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuels and industrial process share 65% in total greenhouse gas emissions, whereas carbon dioxide from forestry and land use change share 11% and methane shares 16%, nitrous oxide shares 6% and other F gases shares 2% in the total greenhouse gas emissions in 2011. If we see sector-wise contribution or share, then we find that electricity and heat production has the highest share in global greenhouse gas emissions with 25% of its share. Agriculture, forestry and land use change contributed 24%. Industries contributed 21%, transportation 14%, building contributed 6% and other energy sources contributed 10% in total greenhouse gas emissions as in 2011. So these are the key attributes of greenhouse gases. Through this table you will be able to know the changing pattern or increase in concentration of various major greenhouse gases since the pre-industrial time, that is in 1750s to the recent time. Here you can see the concentration of carbon dioxide has increased by 41.2%, concentration increased of methane gas is by 170.4% since 1750s, and the concentration increased of nitrous oxide is 20.7%, and concentration of ozone gas has increased by 42% since pre-industrial time in 1750s to the present time. So these are the attributes, and till now you are you have understood the changing pattern of climate change and how the concentration of major greenhouse gases has increased since the pre-industrial time. Then the main question here arises that what are the indicators or measurement are being used to identify that climate is changing. So there are certain indicators which are being used to find out the changing pattern of climatic conditions. The most important indicator is temperature measurement over a long period of time. The changes in temperature shows changes in climatic conditions also. As climatic conditions of any region determines the human civilization, so historical and archaeological evidences of various periods also indicates the changing pattern of climate change. Retreating glaciers and loss of Arctic sea ice in both thickness and extent also shows the rapid change in climatic conditions. And vegetation is a sign of climatic conditions, it is said. Then changes in type, distribution and cover of specific vegetation shows the changing pattern of climatic conditions. Pollen analysis is another indicator of climate change, as pollen analysis involves study of contemporary and fossil polymorphs presents in various layers of sediments, different groups of plants, lakes and ponds, and changes found in the study in different pollen presents often a sign of changing climatic conditions. Dendroclimatology is another indicator in which we study the tree ring growth pattern, which denotes the changing climatic patterns. For example, thick and wider rings indicate the wetter and favorable climatic condition for tree growth, whereas thin and narrow tree growth denotes the drier conditions and less favorable climatic conditions. Whereas sea level change is another indicator of climate change, as I have already mentioned that sea level has increased by 19 centimeters since the starting of last century till now, and the rate of sea level change has increased in the last few decades. So it also shows the changing pattern of climate change. So these are the indicators of climate change. Let's have a look to the various evidences of increased concentration of greenhouse gases and resultant climatic changing pattern of climatic conditions. So here you can see that this graph shows the CO2 concentration, and you can see here that CO2 concentration is at its highest level at present, and throughout the human history it never reached the level of 300 parts per million, but since 1950 it has reached the level of 400 parts per million. So it shows in the last few decades the concentration of CO2 gas has increased very rapidly. And here you can see the relationship between CO2 concentration and temperature increase. The first diagram shows the rate of CO2 concentration into the atmosphere. You can see a rapid increase in the CO2 concentration into the atmosphere, and if we compare this concentration to the increase in temperature, then you find temperature are also increasing with the same pace as the concentration of CO2, and this establishes the fact that temperature is rising because of these anthropogenic concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The relationship can be more factually established through this diagram. Here you can see three bands. The lower band shows the temperature increase through natural forces. The upper thick band shows the temperature increase with human effect, and the black band here shows the observed temperature increase over the last century. Here you can see the temperature increase since 1950 goes with the human effect, not with the natural forces. So this diagram shows a close match between the human effect and the temperature increase over the last half of the century. So in this way we can say that the temperature increase and this climatic condition is a result of the increased concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So let's have a look of another evidences of climate change. Like here you can see the melting of evidences of melting ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. Here you can see that since 2002 the ices of both Antarctica and Greenland are decreasing, and if we compare the situation in both of the region, then it is found that both are losing their land ice sheets. The ice sheet decreasing rate in Antarctica is about 134 billion metric tons of ice per year since 2012, while the Greenland ice sheet has been losing an estimated 287 billion metric tons per year. And let's have another example of sea level rise. As here you can see sea level rise is started since the early 1990s, and here you can see the sea level has continuously rising with the global average rate of 3.14 millimeter per year. Here I would like to tell you, when the average of sea level rise is 3.41 millimeter per year, some of the other regions like Federated States of Micronesia and tropical Western Pacific region are experiencing sea level rise with the pace of 10 millimeters per year and 12 millimeters per year respectively. So these are the situation which are the main concern of the international community in terms of climate change. So here finally I would like to conclude this session. And in this session we have studied the definition of climate and climate change. We have also studied various mechanisms and indicators of climate change. We have also looked into the various evidences of climate change like temperature increase, retreating glaciers, melting of ice sheets, rising sea levels, etc. And these evidences shows the rapid increase in changing pattern of climatic conditions over the last few decades, and finally we have learned through various evidences that the present concern of climatic conditions or changing climate pattern is increased concentration of greenhouse gas emissions or concentrations into the atmosphere. So with this I would like to end this lecture, and here I would also like to tell you that in the next session we will be talking about the global and national impacts of climate change. With this I would like to end this lecture. Thank you. Hello friends, in this session we will be talking about the global and national impacts of climate change. We will also be talking about the concept of vulnerability. We will be discussing various factors which affect the vulnerability level of various countries or regions, and will also evaluate the factors which contribute to the vulnerability level of any country. So we have already learned that the major cause of current changing climatic conditions is increase in greenhouse gas concentration. So let's start by looking at the responses of increased greenhouse gas concentration into the atmosphere. Increase in the greenhouse gases concentration into the atmosphere responses as increase in air and surface temperature, increase in climatic variability and extreme event, and sea level rise. All these responses have significant impact on our social, economic and environmental sectors of human society. Its impact includes coastal submergence, salinization of coastal aquifers, saltwater intrusion, coral bleaching, infrastructural damages, destruction of human settlement, reduced tourism and damages to property and casualty from extreme events. adverse impact on human health, agriculture and fisheries, water availability, etc. For better understanding, we can divide these impacts into various sectors. So let's have a look on the impacts of climate change on environment. Environmental impacts include destruction of ecosystem and habitat due to shifting of weather patterns, drought, wildfire, migration of species, etc. Loss of biodiversity due to disappearing habitat, deforestation. And another impact includes ocean acidification, coral bleaching, due to increased concentration of CO2 into the atmosphere and oceanic water. Sea level rise is another important impact of climate change due to the melting of ice sheets and expanding oceans due to warming oceans and increased concentration of CO2, and increased intensity and frequency of extreme events due to increasing temperature and changing rainfall patterns. Another major impact of changing climatic conditions on environment is changes in water cycle and thus water availability. Here in this picture, which shows a delicate balance of precipitation, evaporation and all the steps in between. As warmer temperature increase the rate of evaporation of water into the atmosphere, in effect increasing the atmosphere's capacity to hold water. Increased evaporation may dry out some areas and fall as excess precipitation on the other areas. You can see here decrease in rainfall here and increase in rainfall in this area of this picture, and changes in the amount of rain falling during the storm provide a clear evidence of changes in water cycle which is already observed by the various scientific international communities. And here you can see how the changes in evaporation rate affects the changes in precipitation pattern. Here the first diagram shows the areas in violet blue color, which shows the areas that are projected to receive more intense precipitation by the end of this century in comparison to the year 1980s and 1999. In contrast, the other diagram here shows that the areas in red, orange or yellow, which shows the regions which are projected to face more dry days in comparison to 1980s to 1999 as a result of climate change. So this situation represents the changing pattern of precipitation due to evaporation and changes in water cycle. So all these environmental impacts have significant impact on our social and economic sector also. So impacts on social sectors include adverse impact on food security due to variations in agricultural production as a result of shifting weather patterns, flood, droughts, and introduction of pests due to the increase in temperature. And water scarcity is another major concern in terms of climate change due to changing pattern of water cycle and decreasing water table. Adverse impact on human health due to increased heat waves, severe storms, air pollution and vector-borne diseases like malaria. Climate-induced migration is another conflict, and migration, disaster-induced migration into different regions, nations led social conflict over scarce resources like food, water, shelter, etc. Destruction of human settlements due to extreme events, wildfire, landslides, floods, etc. All these impacts in human sector resulted in degraded quality of life. The economic sector is also experiencing various negative impact of climate change. That impacts include adverse impact on agricultural production and livestock farming due to temperature variations, changing rainfall patterns, drought, disease to livestock, and adverse impact on tourism and recreational activities, and due to extreme events and storm surges and sea level rise, infrastructural damages due to extreme events as they become subject to greater temperature variations and are exposed to weather that they were not designed for. Adverse impact on forestry activities due to shifting weather patterns, wildfire, introduction of pests, etc. All these adversely impact the overall economic development of any region. And here I would like to tell you, economic impact varies from country to country in respect of their vulnerability level or and the status of their resource and infrastructural development. So the factor vulnerability is very important to determine the impact of climate change to a country specific, as vulnerability to climate change is the degree to which geophysical, biological and socio-economic system are susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse impacts of climate. So there are various factors which contribute to the vulnerability of specific regions, like their extreme exposure to climate induced natural hazards, their sensitivity towards climate induced disasters or hazards, etc. Both exposure and sensitivity determines the potential impact of the natural disaster or event or due to the climate change, and potential impact along with the adaptive capacity or coping capacity determines the vulnerability level of the country or any region. The country, here I would like to tell you, the developed country which with more resources and infrastructure, they have more capability to cope with the impacts of climate change, and thus they are less vulnerable to the impact of climate change. In contrast, developing country who has no resources or less resources to cope with the climate change, thus they are the most vulnerable places in the world. In this diagram, you can see the first part of this picture shows the countries in red or pink or peach shades, shows the country who has the higher emission level of carbon dioxide, and the countries in blue or grey shows the country with the lower level of greenhouse gas emissions, and the lower picture shows the countries with the blue which are the less vulnerable in terms of climate change, and countries in red or pink are the most vulnerable places. And if we compare both of the part of this picture, then we find that the major emitter countries are developed countries who are less vulnerable in terms of climate change, and the country who contribute very less to the emission of greenhouse gases, here you can see they are the most vulnerable places in the world in terms of climate change impact. So there are two groups of countries which are the most vulnerable places as identified by the United Nations, that is small island developing state and least developed countries. According to the United Nations, small island developing states are islands and low-lying coastal countries, and they share several characteristics of other developing countries, but they face unique challenges in terms of climate change. They have some certain geographical characteristics which make them especially vulnerable. For example, their isolation, their fragmented location, their remoteness, small size, all these contribute to their vulnerability. The other group of countries is least developed countries, which represent represent the poorest and the weakest segment of international community, as they comprise more than 80 millions of people, which is about 12% of world population, but accounts for less than 2% of world GDP and about 1% of global trade in goods. So they also having some national issues for development, for example their health issue, poor health infrastructure and food security, water scarcity. There are various characteristics which make them especially vulnerable in terms of climate change. The characteristics which contribute to their vulnerability, that's why the impact are more worse in the case of these particular countries. For example, they have large share of their economy in climatic sensitive sectors like agriculture and forestry. They have high exposure to external shocks and they are prone to natural disasters like floods and droughts, and existing water stress adds to their problem related to the climate change. They have multiple stresses and lower adaptive capacity. For example, they have limited financial, institutional and technological capacities, limited access to knowledge, etc. And they have certain problems at their national level which make all the impacts disproportionately on poor and poorest countries, like their problems in poor health infrastructure, food security, malnutrition, clean water and other resources are the main concern in these countries. And here if we see the contribution of contribution of developed countries and developing or majorly particularly SIDS and LDCs in greenhouse gas emissions, then we find here the huge gap between the emission of developed countries and developing countries. Here I would like to tell you SIDS alone, small island developing states alone, contribute less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they are in the front line to face the consequences of climate change. So there are some evidences which I would like to put before you from LDCs and SIDS, like almost 80% of the population and infrastructure in many island states such as Seychelles, Marshall Island, etc. are around near the coast. In Papua New Guinea and Maldives, approximately 50% to 80% of the land area is under 1 meter above average sea level. In Grenada, critically limited resources are required in order to deal with compelling many short-term problems related to environment. And in Palau Island, extended drought periods are observed and confronted during the El Nino and Southern Oscillation event. More frequent and intense tropical cyclones along with extreme events throughout the South Pacific region were expected since 1990s. Almost all food production, construction material, fuels and other goods are being imported in Barbados and many other small island states. So here, after the global scenario, let's move towards the climatic change impact for India. As India is already experiencing unusual and unprecedented spells of hot weather, and it is projected to occur far more frequently and cover much larger areas. And it is important to note here, with the increase in temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, the west coast and southern India are projected to shift a new high temperature climatic regimes with significant impact on agriculture. And as India is mainly the economy and food security of India depends largely on the agriculture, then this trend is particularly dangerous for India's food security and food production. Another impact which is being observed in terms of climate change is changing rainfall pattern. Here you can see the projected and actual monsoon. There is a great difference between actual and projected monsoon, and a decline in monsoon rainfall since 1950s has already been observed. The frequency of heavy rainfall events has also increased, and it is to note that with the 4-degree increase in temperature, extreme monsoon will occur every 10 years instead of 100 years, and more frequent droughts and flooding are expected to occur with these situations. Dry year will become more drier and wet year will become more wetter. Here you can see another impact of climate change as snow melting. In this diagram you can easily see that the highest rate of snow melting can be seen here in the Indian subcontinent over the Himalayan ranges, and this trend, this decreasing snow cover trend is particularly dangerous for glaciers and glacial flood rivers like the Indus and the Brahmaputra. The Indus and Brahmaputra are expected to see increased flows in spring when the snow melt, with the flows reducing subsequently in the late spring and in the summer. Alteration in the flows of Indus, Ganga and Brahmaputra rivers could significantly impact irrigation, affecting the amount of food that can be produced in their basin as well as livelihood of peoples. Like for example, 209 million people live in Indus basin, 478 million people lives in Ganga basin, and 62 million people live in Brahmaputra basin, and livelihood of these much people are at risk due to the snow level decreasing. And another major impact is related to sea level rise. As you can see here, before 1850 the sea level rise was stagnant, and until 1950 there was a gradual increase in sea level rise, and after 1950 the sea level is rising with a higher rate, and it is projected for future to rise, sea level rise with much higher rate. And with the coastline of more than 7,000 of kilometer, India is particularly vulnerable or threatened in the case of sea level rise. And India is close to equator, so the subcontinent would experience much higher rise in sea levels than the higher latitude. Sea level rise and storm surges would lead to saltwater intrusion in the coastal areas, impacting agriculture, degrading groundwater quality, contaminating drinking water, and possibly causing a rise in diarrhea cases, cholera outbreaks, as the cholera bacterium survives longer in saline water. Kolkata, in the case of coastal cities, Kolkata and Mumbai both are densely populated cities and particularly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise, tropical cyclones and riverine floods. So this the another major impact of climate change in India includes adverse impact on agriculture and threatening food security, as seasonal water scarcity, rising temperature, intrusion of sea water would threaten the crop yields and thus food security of the country. As India is already experiencing the continuous decrease in per capita arable land. For example, in 1950, the per capita arable land in India was 0.48 hectare, which has decreased in 2012 to 0.08 hectare, whereas the population in 2010 2012 was 1.2524 billion, and per capita food requirement was 210 metric tons. And if we see this scenario in 2020, then we find that the population will be 1.3 billion and the per capita food requirement will be 300 metric tons. And if the current trend persists, substantial yield reduction in both rice and wheat can be expected in the near and medium term. And it is to note here that with the increase of 2 degrees Celsius in the temperature by 2050s, the country may need to import more than twice of the amount food grain than would be required without the climate change. In the country, developing country like India, and the water security and energy security is very essential for sustainable development. So impact of climate change also threatening this sector of the country, as water security is already under pressure due to urbanization, population growth, economic development and increasing demand for water for agriculture and industries. Climate change and variability in monsoon is expected to increase for water shortage in some areas. Many studies have found that the threat of water security is very high over the central India, along with the mountain ranges of the Western Ghat and in India northeastern states. And this water scarcity situation in India is hampering the energy security sector, as this scarcity of water can undermine the two dominant forms of power generation in India, like hydropower and thermal power generation, and both of which depend on adequate water supply to function effectively. The increasing water variability and long-term decreases in river flow can have a major challenge to hydropower plants and increase the risk of physical damage from landslides, flash flood, glacier lake outburst and climate related natural hazards. These are the major impacts of climate change in India. Along with these challenges, India is facing many other challenges in terms of climate change, like adverse impact on human health, increased frequency and increased events events of droughts, etc. So these are the major challenges in terms of climate change for India for sustainable development. And with this, I would like to end this lecture. And here I would like to tell you that in the next lecture we will be talking about the relationship between sustainable development and climate change, how climate change is affecting sustainable development efforts globally and nationally. With this, I would like to end this lecture. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank ma'am for this very enriching discussion, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.